What would you do if you had to choose between calling the police and burying your own son? That night, as my husband, a federal judge, coldly watched our son die at the dining room table, I chose silence. For the next 1,095 days, I played a part. I served dinner to his murderer. I slept in the same bed with him. I smiled at dinner parties while my heart was dead. My story takes place in Philadelphia, but I know this pain and betrayal can be understood globally. No matter where you are listening from in the world, please let me know where you're from in the comments. He thought I was broken by fear. He didn't know that every second of that silence was a step in the most meticulous revenge plan ever crafted. My name is Josephine Callahan, and this is the story of how I became an accomplice in order to become an executioner. The Philadelphia of gated communities and shopping malls didn't even exist in my girlhood dreams. My father, Walter Rossi, had come from Calabria after the war. He had no formal education, but he knew the names of all the constellations and recited poems by Dante from memory. My mom, Alice, she had finished what they called grammar school before she had to drop everything to work. They both had that immigrant thing, you know? That hunger to see their children go further. Go study, Josephine. No one can ever take your books away from you. That's what Mom always said when I complained about having to help in the kitchen after school. At my house, the dining table was always cluttered. On one side, Mom's fabrics and patterns. On the other, my notebooks and borrowed library books. In the middle, the simple food that sustained us. Pasta almost every day, sometimes with sauce, sometimes just with butter when money was tight at the end of the month. There were 4 of us kids, but I was the only one who really took to my studies. My older brothers went to work with Dad as soon as they could. I stayed up late with a small lamp on, studying with a blanket over my back, because the cold seeped through the cracks in the walls. When I said I wanted to apply to UPenn, my father almost choked on his wine. College? What for? Go be an elementary school teacher, find a good husband, and be done with it. But my mom, she looked at me with those deep-set eyes, ran her hand through my hair and said, "If that's what you want, Bambina, then go." I'll never forget how she pawned her wedding jewelry, the only things of value she had, to pay for my SAT prep course. You never forget those things, you know? They're seared into you like a hot iron. The day I got my acceptance letter to the English department, it was the first time I saw my father cry. Not from joy, from worry. How are we going to pay for this, Madonna Mia? I already had it all planned out. I'd study during the day and tutor at night. On weekends, I worked at a bookstore downtown. I slept 4-5 hours a night. I got so thin my clothes just hung on me. But every minute inside that university was like breathing different air. It was as if, for the first time, I could see beyond the end of my street in South Philly. The hardships, my God. There were so many I could write a book just about them. I had no money for lunch, so I'd bring a bologna sandwich wrapped in a paper napkin. No money for the books, so I spent hours in the library, copying chapters by hand. No money for the full bus fare, so I'd often walk to the subway to save one leg of the trip. My classmates didn't understand why I never went to the parties, the bars, the spring break trips. How could I explain that every penny was counted back home? That my shoes were patched by my mom every week? That I was ashamed to bring friends home because the bathroom was in the yard? But I was as stubborn as a mule. I graduated in 4 years with honors. I was the class valedictorian. When I stood on that stage, in a borrowed cap and gown that Mom had hastily altered, I saw my father in the audience. He had put on his wedding suit, the one saved for special occasions, and he was sitting stiffly in his chair, as if he didn't quite know what to do there among all those people. But when they called my name, he was the one who clapped the loudest. It was the first time in my life I felt truly proud of who I was. Josephine Rossi, the first university graduate from a family of Italian steelworkers. What I didn't know was that this diploma would take me much further than I ever imagined. I soon got a job as an adjunct professor right there at UPenn, a rarity for a recent graduate. But my grades and glowing recommendations from professors opened doors. And it was in one of those academic hallways that I met Arthur. Oh God. Today, I know that meeting turned my life inside out, but at the time, it seemed almost like a miracle. It was an interdisciplinary symposium on literature and law. I had been invited at the last minute to replace a speaker who got sick. I was nervous, sweating bullets, feeling like an imposter among experienced academics. I spoke about Herman Melville and social critique in American literature. When I finished, a man in the front row raised his hand. Tall, elegant, graying at the temples, though he wasn't much older than me. Professor Rossi, your analysis of how Melville uses irony as a tool to critique the legal system of the era is fascinating. I'd like to continue this discussion over coffee after the event. Arthur Callahan was a tenured professor at the law school, the son of an appellate judge, the grandson of a Supreme Court justice. He had that air of someone who never had to worry if his shoes had holes or if the money would last until the end of the month. He spoke French, German, and English. He personally knew authors I had only read in books. He lived in a huge apartment in Rittenhouse Square, full of art and a library that made my jaw drop on my first visit. Next to him, I felt like a wide-eyed country girl. I can't really explain what happened between us. It was fast, intense, almost violent in its pace. In 3 months, we were engaged. In 6, we were married. My mother, always suspicious, pulled me aside before the ceremony. Josephine, a man like that, from a different world. Often, they can't handle it when the novelty wears off. Are you sure? I was. Or I thought I was. Arthur treated me as an intellectual equal, proudly introduced me to his friends, encouraged me to continue my studies, and, most importantly, didn't seem to care about my humble origins. On the contrary, he said my authenticity was refreshing in the academic world, which was so full of fakes. The wedding was simple but elegant. Arthur insisted on paying for everything, including a wedding dress that cost more than all the furniture in my parents' house combined. My father, uncomfortable in that environment, drank too much at the reception and had to be held up by Mom. It was the last time I really saw him. 3 months later, he had a heart attack at the steel mill. He didn't make it. Arthur took care of everything, from the funeral to the financial support for my mother, who was lost without her husband. I was so immersed in grief that I barely noticed how he took control of everything, from the family's finances to my mother's future, who ended up moving in with my older brother upstate. In the first few years, our life seemed like something out of one of those novels I analyzed in class. I moved into his apartment, our apartment, as he always insisted on correcting me. I started my master's while teaching at private colleges. Arthur advanced in his legal career, becoming more respected, more connected. We traveled to Europe, all over the U.S. I, who had never left Pennsylvania, was now dining in Paris and visiting museums in New York. It was like one of those dreams you're afraid to wake up from. When I got pregnant, 2 years after the wedding, Arthur was ecstatic. He wanted a son, of course. Family tradition, he said. I didn't care. I just wanted a healthy child. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Violent nausea, high blood pressure, risk of miscarriage. I had to stop working in the 4th month, put on absolute bed rest. Arthur hired nurses, the best doctors. I felt like a fragile incubator, guarding a precious treasure. Liam was born via emergency C-section, almost 2 months premature. So small he fit in his father's palm. He spent weeks in the NICU, surrounded by machines and uncertainty. It was the first time I saw Arthur truly vulnerable, sitting beside the incubator, whispering promises to that tiny being fighting to live. During those nights in the hospital, I think we grew closer than in all our time dating and married. There was a shared fragility, a fear that equalized our very different origins. When we finally brought Liam home, the doctors were clear. The complications had been severe. I couldn't have any more children. A postpartum infection almost killed me, required emergency surgery, and resulted in a hysterectomy. Arthur said it didn't matter, that Liam was all we needed. Deep down, I felt an immense sadness. I had always dreamed of a house full of children, like my parents. But life sometimes chooses for us, doesn't it? The first few years with Liam made up for any pain. He was smart, curious, full of life. He seemed to have inherited the best of both of us, my love for books and his father's determination. From the time he was little, he'd sit on my lap while I graded papers, pretending to read the students' work. Arthur made a point of taking him to the courthouse on school holidays, proudly showing his son off to his colleagues. "This one's going to be a Supreme Court justice one day. You mark my words." Meanwhile, our careers advanced in parallel. I finished my PhD when Liam was 4, with a thesis on marginalized American literature that caused quite a stir. Arthur was already a renowned judge, mentioned for higher courts. Our social life revolved around academia and the judiciary, dinners, conferences, book launches. I, who grew up eating pasta with butter at a table cluttered with fabrics, was now serving cocktails to appellate judges and university presidents in my professionally decorated living room. But there was something strange about this parallel rise. While my success came the hard way, sleepless nights, writing, heated debates, research proposals that were sometimes rejected, Arthur's always seemed smoother, more guaranteed. People opened doors for him with an enthusiasm that intrigued me. Promotions came when least expected. Invitations for international lectures appeared out of nowhere. At the time, I attributed it to his talent, his family connections, the natural charm he had. Liam grew up in this environment of academic and legal ambition. He went to the best private schools, had private lessons in everything imaginable, from piano to Mandarin. He was a sweet, sensitive boy, but with a streak of justice that sometimes scared me. I remember one time, he must have been about 8. He came home from school devastated because a classmate had been unfairly accused of cheating on a test. He spent the whole week gathering evidence that the real culprit was another boy. When he managed to prove the truth, he came running to tell me, his eyes shining. "Mom, I'm going to be a lawyer just like Dad, but only to defend people who are innocent." That memory always comes back to haunt me. Because, in a way, that's exactly what he tried to do 15 years later. And that's why he died. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Before the tragedy, there were years of a happiness that I now see had invisible cracks. I got a position as department chair at a reputable private university, Keystone University. Arthur continued to climb the judicial ladder, more respected, more powerful. Our house was a meeting point for intellectuals, jurists, politicians. I loved those gatherings, the heated discussions about literature, politics, philosophy. Arthur seemed proud to see me shine in those moments, although sometimes I'd notice a strange look when I disagreed with him publicly. Nothing serious, just a flash of something I couldn't name at the time. When Liam became a teenager, he discovered his own passion. Journalism. It wasn't what Arthur expected. He had always imagined his son following in his footsteps in law. There was tension, arguments, slammed doors. I was stuck in the middle, trying to mediate. "He's still young, he'll change his mind," Arthur would say, as if it were just a phase. But Liam was determined like his father and passionate like me. At 17, he was already writing for the school paper and doing unpaid internships at newsrooms during vacations. It was around then that I started to notice the first significant changes in Arthur. Frequent irritation, phone calls he'd take by walking away from us, late-night meetings he never really explained. I blamed it on work stress, career pressure. Even when he started controlling the household finances more, questioning my spending, which was never extravagant, I didn't see the signs of something darker. I was too busy with my own career. I had just been offered the position of dean of the college, a job that required total dedication. The years went by, intertwined with ambitions, achievements, and that security of someone who believes they've built something solid. When Liam was accepted into the journalism program at UPenn, Arthur finally seemed to accept his son's choice. He even threw a celebratory dinner, invited important friends, toasted the family's future great journalist. Little did we know, we were all toasting the beginning of the end. Time passes so quickly when you're busy, you know. One day your son is that tiny baby in the incubator, and the next, he's a grown man with strong opinions and his own dreams. Liam graduated with honors, just as I had decades before. At graduation, wearing the same color cap and gown I had worn, he hugged me tight and whispered, "Thanks for always believing in me, Mom." Arthur took several pictures, proud, but I remember there was something strange in the air between them. A tension I didn't understand, a distance that wasn't there before. A few weeks after graduation, Liam got a job at the Philadelphia Inquirer. It wasn't a prominent position, Just a rookie reporter on the city desk. But he was beaming. "Mom, it's just the start. I'm going to do important stories that change people's lives." I smiled, recognizing in him the same idealism I had in my early 20s. Arthur seemed less enthusiastic. "Journalism is a thankless profession, son. Poorly paid and full of risks these days. I still think you should have gone to law school. Because you see, hell doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in slowly, like those little leaks in the ceiling you ignore until the day the whole house comes crashing down." Our life really changed when I turned 60. I had just taken over as the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. The first woman in the position, I might add. My office was on the top floor of the historic building, with a view of the city. On clear days, I could even see the courthouse where Arthur worked. Ironic, isn't it? The same month I got my promotion, he was appointed as a federal judge. It was a whirlwind in our social life. Dinners, interviews, congratulations. Arthur even joked, "Now we're the most powerful couple in Philadelphia academia." I laughed. I thought it was funny. Little did I know that too much power in certain people's hands is worse than a loaded gun in a child's. Liam was 22 at the time. He had just started his job at the Philadelphia Inquirer, specializing in investigative journalism. He was still living at home, but already had that independent streak of someone just waiting for the right moment to fly the coop. It was beautiful to see, you know. That boy who almost didn't survive the incubator was now a tall man, broad-shouldered and full of ideals. He had his father's eyes, but thank God, his heart took after my side of the family. Liam believed in justice in an almost innocent way, almost dangerous. As I also believed at his age. The first cracks started to appear during this period, but I was too busy with my new position to pay proper attention. Arthur, who had always been controlling in a subtle way, began to show a more possessive side. He questioned my decisions at the university, criticized professors I hired, wanted to approve the agenda for every meeting I chaired. "It's just to protect you, dear. The academic world is full of venomous snakes." That's what he'd say in that smooth voice he used in court. At home, things were changing too. Arthur started buying everything new. Expensive furniture, works of art, luxury cars. Suddenly, our Rittenhouse Square apartment wasn't enough. "We need a bigger house, Josephine, one that befits our position." We bought a mansion in Bryn Mawr, on the main line. 3 floors, 6 bedrooms, a pool. He even hired a driver. It all seemed excessive to me, but Arthur insisted it was important to keep up appearances. That phrase, keep up appearances. I would later find out just how much it was hiding. Then came the lake house in the Poconos. One day, just like that, Arthur came home with the papers for a property on the most exclusive part of the lake, almost $1 million at the time. "How can we afford this?" I asked, alarmed. Our situation was comfortable, but we weren't that rich. Our salaries, even though good, didn't justify that kind of extravagance. "I've made good investments in recent years," he replied vaguely, and had some extra fees from consulting. I accepted the explanation. Who wouldn't? He was my husband of over 20 years, the father of my child, a man respected by society. Liam was the first to be suspicious. One Sunday afternoon, we were having lunch at the new lake house. Arthur had stepped out to take a phone call, as he always did, moving away so we couldn't hear. Liam looked out at the lake through the huge picture window and asked, "Mom, how much does a house like this cost?" I gave him an approximate value, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. He did some quick math in his head. He was always good with numbers and commented, "With your 2 salaries, it would take about 15 years to save up this much, even saving aggressively." I changed the subject, talked about the sunset, about the dinner I was going to make, but the seed of doubt had been planted. In the following weeks, I noticed Liam was quieter, more observant. He'd come home late, wouldn't say exactly where he'd been, always seemed distracted by something. I attributed it to work, to first loves, that phase of finding your own way. One night, he came home with deep dark circles under his eyes. I found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m., drinking coffee and scribbling in a notebook he quickly closed when he saw me. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" "Everything's great, Mom. Just a complicated story I'm investigating." And then came the first serious confrontation. We were having dinner, all three of us, something increasingly rare with our busy schedules. Arthur was talking about expanding the Poconos house, building another wing, maybe a helipad. Liam suddenly dropped his silverware. The sound of the metal against the fine china froze the table. "Dad, where exactly is all this money coming from?" Arthur's face hardened. It was an expression I had rarely seen, that cold mask he used to intimidate lawyers in court. "From my hard work of over 20 years, son. And I don't appreciate that tone of interrogation in my own home." "Then you won't mind showing me the deeds, the payment records? Because from what I've researched, this house cost a lot more than $1 million. It was closer to 3, wasn't it? $3 million. And it was bought by an offshore company registered in the Cayman Islands." The blood drained from Arthur's face. In that moment, I swear, I didn't recognize my husband. It was as if a mask had fallen off, revealing a stranger sitting at our table. "Are you investigating me, Liam? Your own father?" His voice was low, controlled, but filled with a rage that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "No, Dad. I'm investigating a story about corruption in the Pennsylvania judiciary. You just happened to show up in it." Liam stood up, far too calm, almost indifferent. "I'm going to sleep at a friend's house tonight. We should talk when you're calmer." And he left, leaving a silence as thick as lead in the dining room. That heavy, leaden silence. It's the sound of a family breaking apart at the seams. Josephine must have felt the floor drop out from under her. But this confrontation, as terrifying as it was only the first domino to fall. I spent the night trying to get explanations out of Arthur. He clammed up. "They're complicated business deals, Josephine. Legitimate investments. Liam is confusing things, trying to make a splash with a sensationalist story." The more he talked, the less I recognized the man I had shared a bed with for 2 decades. There was something artificial in his explanations, too rehearsed, as if he were in a hearing instead of a conversation with his wife. The next morning, Liam returned. He asked to speak to me alone. We went to my home office, the one room Arthur rarely entered. My son had a thick folder under his arm. "Mom, I need to show you something, and I need you to keep an open mind." He opened the folder and started spreading documents across the desk. Bank statements, deeds, photos, transcripts of conversations. A mosaic of evidence that, together, formed a monstrous picture. Dad has been involved in a pay-to-play scheme for at least 5 years. He and 4 other judges take bribes to favor certain lawyers and their clients, businessmen, politicians, even drug traffickers. They created shell companies to launder the money. "The Poconos house was bought with dirty money, Mom." His voice was calm, professional, as if he were presenting a college paper and not destroying our family. "How did you find all this?" It was the only thing I could ask, my throat as dry as paper. It started by chance. A colleague at the paper mentioned rumors of a scheme at the courthouse. I wasn't even going to investigate, but then I heard the name of the firm of Shaw and Associates. Remember them? They're the lawyers who always come to dinner parties here. He started pulling the thread, and the more he pulled, he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so much like his father's it made my heart ache. "Liam, are you absolutely sure about this? These are terrible accusations. It could destroy your father's career, our family, everything we've built." He looked at me with a mixture of compassion and determination that reminded me of myself at his age. "Mom, I've checked and rechecked every piece of information. I have reliable sources, documents, recordings. Dad is guilty. There's no doubt. The question is, what do we do now? What do we do now? As if there were a manual for discovering your husband is corrupt and your son is about to expose him nationally. I was paralyzed between 2 loves, 2 loyalties. "I need time, Liam. I need to talk to your father, understand his side." My son nodded, disappointed but understanding. "Take all the time you need, Mom. But just know, I'm publishing this story in 2 weeks, with or without your approval." I spent the next few days in a private hell. I couldn't look at Arthur without imagining the double life he was leading. I couldn't talk to Liam without feeling like I was betraying my husband. At night, lying next to Arthur, I'd watch his profile in the dark, trying to reconcile the man I loved with the criminal my son described. How had I not noticed before? What signs had I ignored? What lies had I swallowed for the sake of comfort, fear, or love? 5 days after that talk with Liam, I came home early from the university. The meeting with the Board of Trustees had ended sooner than expected. The house was silent, except for raised voices coming from Arthur's study. I approached without making a sound, my heart racing. "Do you think you can threaten me, you little punk? Do you think you can play with fire and not get burned?" It was Arthur's voice, unrecognizable, so heavy with hate. "It's not a threat, Dad. It's journalism. It's the truth. You're the one who chose this path." Liam's voice sounded tired, almost resigned. "Truth? You don't know anything about truth or justice. The whole system is rotten. I just played by the existing rules. How many judges do you think are honest in this country? 10%? Less? That doesn't justify anything. You betrayed your oath. You betrayed the public trust. Innocent people were hurt by your bought and paid for decisions." I heard the sound of something being thrown against the wall, a book, a heavy object. "And what do you plan to do? Destroy me? Destroy your own family? This apartment, that university where your mother works. It was all built with this money you call dirty. I know, Dad, and I live with that guilt every day. But I can't anymore. I'm publishing the story next week. I'm telling you this out of respect, out of consideration for Mom. More noises, like furniture being dragged. You're not doing this, Liam. I won't allow it. You can't stop me. I've already given copies of all the evidence to trusted people. If anything happens to me, the story comes out anyway. You must be wondering, then why didn't the story come out? Believe me, I've asked myself that 1,000 nights. Liam, my poor boy, he trusted them. But fear. Oh, fear can extinguish even the bravest truth. Or perhaps, Arthur acted before my son's body was even cold. I backed away, terrified by what I was hearing. My son had anticipated that his own father might. What? Hurt him? The idea was so absurd I couldn't even complete the thought. I went to my room, locked the door, and cried like I hadn't cried since my father's death. When Arthur came looking for me hours later, I faked a headache. Said I needed to sleep. He didn't insist. He seemed distracted, distant, planning something. The next day, Arthur was transformed. Calm, smiling. Almost the man I had fallen in love with decades ago. "Josephine, we need to talk about Liam." We sat on the terrace, coffee cups between us, as if we were a normal couple discussing routine family problems. I think I was too hard on the boy. He's confused, misinterpreting some legitimate, though complex, business deals. I studied his face, looking for signs of the fury I had heard the day before. There were none. It was as if that person had never existed. "Here's what we'll do. I'll invite Liam to dinner tomorrow. Just the three of us, like old times. I'll explain everything, show him the legal documents. I'll clear up these misunderstandings." His voice was poured honey, smooth, convincing. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe that it was all just a misunderstanding, that my husband wasn't a criminal, that my son wouldn't have to destroy our family in the name of the truth. "Do you really think you can fix this, Arthur?" He took my hand, caressed it like he did when we were young. "Trust me, Josephine. We've always solved everything together, haven't we? This will be no different." I agreed, more out of emotional exhaustion than conviction. I called Liam, invited him to dinner. He hesitated, but finally accepted. "I'll hear what he has to say, Mom, but I'm not changing my mind." The day of the dinner arrived. I asked our housekeeper to prepare Liam's favorite dishes: mushroom risotto, arugula salad with parmesan, that red wine he liked. I set out the best china, arranged flowers on the table. It was as if I were preparing a set for a play I knew would end badly, but I still clung to the hope of a last-minute miracle. Arthur came home early from work, a rarity. He brought more wine, an expensive champagne. "To celebrate our reconciliation," he explained, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He went to take a shower while I finished setting the table. When he came out of the bathroom, he asked me to serve the wine while we waited for Liam. "Let's save the champagne for when he arrives," a toast to the reunited family. Liam arrived promptly at 8. He looked worn out, with those deep, dark circles, but determined. He had a folder under his arm, probably more documents, more proof. He hugged me tightly, as if he knew something was wrong. He greeted his father with a formal handshake. Arthur, surprisingly, pulled him into a hug. "Son, I'm so glad you came. We have a lot to talk about. But first, let's celebrate being together." He got the champagne bottle, opened it with a festive pop, and poured 3 glasses. A toast to the Callahan family, to the past we share and the future we will build together. He raised his glass. Liam hesitated, but eventually raised his. I followed the gesture, mesmerized by the scene's theatricality, by the false normalcy. We toasted. Arthur took a small sip. Liam, perhaps out of nervousness, drank almost half the glass at once. I barely wet my lips. My stomach was too twisted for alcohol. We sat at the table. Arthur began a monologue about misunderstandings, about how certain financial transactions look suspicious to untrained eyes, about how investigative journalism sometimes sees crime where there is only complex business. He spoke with the fluency of a professor giving a lecture, a lawyer before a jury. Liam listened in silence, occasionally taking another sip of champagne. I noticed he seemed increasingly pale. "Dad, with all due respect, that doesn't explain the recordings I have, nor the testimony from lawyers who paid for privileged access to you." Liam's voice sounded slurred, as if he were very tired. He blinked several times, seeming to struggle to stay focused. "What recordings, son? I imagine they are conversations taken out of context. If you show them to me, I can explain every one." Arthur remained calm, his smile placid, as he poured more champagne for Liam. I don't feel well." Liam put his hand to his forehead. Beads of sweat were starting to form on his temple. "It must be exhaustion, son. You've been working too hard on that investigation of yours." The way Arthur pronounced that last word, with poorly disguised contempt, set off an alarm inside me. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Liam?" I touched his arm, noticing how hot and feverish it was. He tried to stand up, but his legs didn't seem to respond properly. The glass slipped from his fingers, spilling champagne on the white tablecloth. "Mom, there's something in the wine." His voice was almost inaudible now. I looked at Arthur, searching for concern, alarm, any normal reaction from a father seeing his son collapse. What I found was a calculating, almost clinical gaze, observing Liam like a scientist, observing an experiment in progress. "Arthur, what did you do?" My voice came out strangled, unrecognizable even to myself. He didn't answer. He just kept watching Liam, who was now sliding out of his chair, his breathing becoming more difficult. "Arthur, what did you put in his drink?" I tried to get up, to run to the phone, call an ambulance, do anything. But Arthur was faster. He grabbed my arm with enough force to leave marks. "Sit down, Josephine. There's nothing you can do now." His voice was pure ice. "Are you insane? That's your son. Our son." I tried to pull away, but he was much stronger. Liam was now on the floor, convulsing. Foam was starting to form at the corner of his mouth. His eyes, wide with panic, met mine. There was a plea in them, a cry for help I will never forget. He was going to destroy us, Josephine. He was going to throw away everything we built. For a newspaper story, for a moment of professional glory. What kind of son does that to his own parents? Arthur spoke as if he were arguing a case in court. Rational, articulate, while our son died a few feet away from us. I finally managed to break free. I ran to Liam, lifted his head onto my lap. "Hold on, my love. Mommy's going to call for help." But I knew, deep in my soul, it was too late. His whole body was shaking. His lips had turned a bluish color. "It's no use calling anyone, Josephine. What he took leaves no trace in the system. It will look like a sudden, massive heart attack. Tragedy in the federal judge's family. Only son dies suddenly during family dinner." Liam stopped shaking. His eyes, still open, no longer saw me. The hand I was holding lost its strength, fell inert onto the marble floor of the dining room. My son was dead, murdered by his own father. And I hadn't been able to save him. Right here, in this instant, Josephine's world ends. The horror of watching your child die, helpless, at the hands of the man you loved, It's unimaginable. But what happens after the murder is, in some ways, even more chilling. And the silent promise I made to Liam as I closed his eyes for the last time, his sacrifice would not be in vain. The truth would come out, no matter what it cost. Even if I had to feign complicity with his murderer to achieve it. Get up, Josephine. Arthur's voice snapped me out of the immediate daze of grief. We have to act quickly. I need you to help me. Help him? Can you imagine? My son's eyes weren't even closed. His body was still warm in my arms. But in that very second, I knew. Josephine, the wife, the mother, had died with Liam. There was only something else left. Something cold and watching and waiting. I raised my eyes, feeling a hatred so pure, so absolute. I was surprised the thought alone didn't kill him. Help you? You murdered our son, and you want me to help? He shrugged, as if we were discussing a trivial household problem. Yes, because if you don't help, you'll go to jail as an accomplice. Who will believe the wife didn't know about her husband's business? Who will believe the mother didn't participate in the death of the son who threatened to expose her too? Think, Josephine. Use that intelligence I've always admired in you. The calculated coldness with which he spoke, the blatant manipulation, showed me a side of Arthur I had never seen in 25 years of marriage. And the worst part, he was right. Who would believe me against a respected federal judge? What would happen if I called the police right now? It would be my word against his. I had no proof he had poisoned Liam. I had no way to prove I didn't know about his corruption schemes. My testimony would be invalidated as that of a hysterical wife. And Arthur, with his connections, would ensure I rotted in a cell for the rest of my life. Or worse. What do you want me to do? I asked, feeling a part of myself die along with my son. Arthur smiled, satisfied with my apparent surrender. First, we clean up any trace of the champagne. Then, you'll help me put Liam in the car. We'll say he felt sick during dinner, that we tried to rush him to the hospital, but we didn't make it in time. He spoke like someone planning a vacation, methodical, organized. As I followed his instructions, moving like an automaton, something inside me solidified. A cold, calculated decision. Arthur hadn't just murdered Liam. He had killed the Josephine I used to be. We cleaned the house. We arranged Liam's body in the back seat of the car as if he had fainted. Arthur got in the driver's seat and sped toward the hospital. I sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly as the city lights blurred past. But halfway there, Arthur suddenly slammed on the brakes, pulling the car onto a dark side street. The engine idled, the silence in the car deafening. "This won't work," he said, his voice flat, analytical. He was staring straight ahead, not at me. "What?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "The hospital," he said, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. "They'll ask questions. A healthy 2-year-old doesn't just die. They'll run a toxicology screen. They'll find the poison. It's messy. It leaves too much to chance." He put the car in gear, but not toward the hospital. He made a U-turn. "Where are we going?" I asked, a new kind of dread rising in me. "We're going home," he said, his voice now filled with the cold authority I'd heard in the courtroom. "There is a better way, a cleaner way, a way I can control." And right there, in that car, with my son's body cooling in the back seat, I realized the man I had married wasn't just a killer. He was a meticulous planner. And I, his grieving wife, was now his primary accomplice. I would have to deceive the master of deception. But first, I would have to survive. I would have to deceive the master of deception. And to do that, I would have to become the best actress the world had ever seen. Because for the next weeks, months, maybe years, I would have to live beside my son's killer, smiling while I planned his downfall. You know what the strangest thing is when you discover you're living with a monster? It's how eerily normal everything becomes. How life insists on moving forward, even when you think the world should stop spinning. The night I lost my son, I thought I would die with him. That my heart would simply give up beating, that my lungs would forget how to breathe. But no, the body is a stubborn machine. It keeps functioning even when the soul has already departed. We returned home not from the hospital, but from that dark side street. Me, destroyed by grief. Arthur, already calculating his next steps. We hadn't even taken our coats off when he started setting the stage, parking the car in the garage with our son still inside. "We need to decide on the official version. Josephine," he said, walking straight to the bar to pour himself a drink. He spoke as if we were planning a press release about changes at the university, not about the death of our son. "The heart attack is a plausible explanation, but it will raise suspicions in someone so young. The heart attack idea was flawed. A suicide is more convincing." I looked at him, as if I were seeing an alien. Who was this man? How could I have slept beside him for over 20 years without noticing the void where a soul should be? Suicide? No one will believe that. Liam loved life. He had plans, dreams. He was about to publish the most important story of his career. Arthur smiled in that way that now made me nauseous, that smile of someone who knows more than everyone else. Exactly. That's why it's perfect. The idealistic young journalist who discovers something so terrible about his own father that he can't cope with the truth. Tragic, moving. No one will question it. I sat on the sofa, my legs too weak to support me. "You're sick, Arthur. Completely sick." He approached, sat beside me, took my hands in his. I had to fight the impulse to pull away. "Josephine, listen carefully. This is the situation. Our son is dead. Nothing will bring him back. We now have two options. Either we go along with this explanation, or we both go to prison. Do you think anyone will believe you didn't know about my business, that you didn't participate in his death? How many criminals' wives swear their innocence in court every day, and how many are believed?" His logic was cold as ice, sharp as a razor. And the worst part, it made sense. "Besides," he continued, stroking my hand as if we were a normal couple discussing vacation plans, "there are some things about your family you wouldn't want to come to light." I froze. He knew. Of course he knew. Your brother Frank. That little problem with embezzlement at the company where he worked. I managed to quash the case back then, but the documents still exist. And your mother? The psychiatric treatment she still receives at that private hospital? Who do you think pays for that? The manipulation was so blatant that in any other circumstance, I would have reacted with fury. But at that moment, destroyed by grief and shock, I could only think of my elderly mother, dependent on expensive psychiatric medication after a nervous breakdown years ago. Of my brother, who made a stupid mistake in his youth and rebuilt his life thanks to the favor Arthur had done, silencing witnesses and destroying evidence. "What exactly do you want from me?" I finally asked. He smiled, satisfied that I was understanding the situation, as he put it. "I want you to confirm the suicide story. Tell the doctors that Liam had been depressed, distant, that you found worrying notes in his room, that you had even scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist, but didn't make it in time." He stood up, went to his study, and returned with a piece of paper. A suicide note, in Liam's perfectly imitated handwriting. "How did you get this?" I asked, horrified by the perfect forgery. "I have resources, dear, friends in strategic places, and countless examples of our son's handwriting around the house. It wasn't difficult." He said, "It wasn't difficult. To forge his own son's handwriting to cover a murder. Do you understand that level of cruelty? This wasn't a crime of passion. It was pure, calculated evil. And that's when I knew. I was living with a demon in a man's suit. Arthur had thought of everything. In the following hours, he called people, moved invisible pieces on a macabre chessboard. The medical examiner, an old college buddy, didn't request a detailed autopsy. The police captain assigned to the case was a personal friend, a regular at our dinner parties. You see, that wasn't the first time he bent the law. Power, my friends, isn't just about money. It's a network of favors, of secrets, of dinners, built over decades. That night, Arthur simply called in his debts, and they were paid. The editor of the paper where Liam worked received a call from Arthur at 3 a.m. A conversation I couldn't hear, but whose content I suspected. Veiled threats, perhaps promises of future favors. When the sun rose, the official version was already being built. Liam Callahan, 22, only son of the respected federal judge Arthur Callahan and University Dean Josephine Callahan, had committed suicide after a depressive episode he had hidden from family and friends. a tragedy that shook the Philadelphia legal community and academic circles. The days that followed were a blur of pain, medication, and forced acting. Arthur took me to a psychiatrist, another friend from his network of influence who prescribed anti-anxiety meds and antidepressants in massive doses. To help you cope with the grief, he said, but I knew the truth. It was to keep me docile, confused, unable to react. The pills left my mind foggy, my thoughts slow. Sometimes I'd spend hours staring at the wall, unable to form a coherent idea. The funeral was the first major test. The church was packed. Colleagues from the courthouse, professors from the university, students, journalists. Arthur, impeccable in a black suit, supported me like the dedicated husband the public knew. He gave a speech about his brilliant son who, unfortunately, hid his inner demons. He spoke of the pressure of investigative journalism, the sleepless nights, the signs they should have seen. It was such a convincing performance that, for moments, I almost believed it myself. When it was my turn to speak, Arthur squeezed my arm, a silent reminder of our agreement. I went to the pulpit, trembling, the effect of the medication giving me an appropriately devastated appearance. Liam was light, I began, my voice failing. The words that came out next weren't mine. They were rehearsed phrases Arthur had written, that he had made me memorize, about how Liam had always been a sensitive boy, how he demanded too much of himself, how in recent months he had been distant, worried. Every word was a stab in my mother's heart. Every lie, a betrayal of my son's memory. After the ceremony at the cemetery, I watched that casket being lowered into the earth and thought, it's not fair. It's not fair that he's in there, and his murderer is up here, receiving condolences. A colleague from the university approached, hugged me tightly. Josephine, don't blame yourself. Depression is a silent illness. No one could have guessed. I nodded, unable to respond. How could I explain that the real silent illness was the man beside me, smiling politely as he accepted sympathies for the death he himself had caused? We returned home, to that house that would never be a home again. Arthur had already planned the next steps. You'll take a leave of absence from the university, obviously. A few months to recover from the trauma. I'll also reduce my schedule at the courthouse. The grieving couple needs time to heal their wounds. He spoke as if directing a play, handing out blocking and lines. The next morning, the newspapers carried the story. Judge's son commits suicide. Some of the more sensationalist ones speculated on the motives. Others, more respectful, limited themselves to describing the tragedy that shook Philadelphia's legal and academic elite. One of them, the very paper where Liam worked, ran a short note, almost hidden on page 6. No details, no context. The story that was supposed to be the great investigation of his career, reduced to 3 paragraphs about his death. Arthur monitored everything. The papers I read, the calls I received, the visitors. He hired a nurse in reality, a spy to take care of me during my medical leave. Beatrice, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, slept in the next room and accompanied me even to the bathroom, under the pretext that I might do something rash. Weeks passed in a limbo of medication, surveillance, and suffocated pain. I could barely think clearly, let alone plan anything. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming, Liam's face dying in my arms, as vivid as on the night of the crime. Arthur managed these crises with clinical efficiency. More pills, calming teas prepared by Beatrice, sometimes even an injection prescribed by the doctor when I got too agitated. A month after Liam's death, I received a call from the university president. He wanted to visit, to discuss an appropriate tribute to my son. Arthur, of course, monitored the entire conversation, sitting beside me as I spoke on the phone. That would be an honor, I replied mechanically, following the invisible script. The president came the next day, accompanied by the communications director. They brought a proposal to create a scholarship in Liam's name. For young talents in journalism who, like your son, demonstrate a commitment to truth and social justice. The irony was so cruel I almost laughed hysterically. Arthur, sensing my state, quickly took control of the conversation, emotionally thanking them for the initiative. Josephine is still very fragile, he explained, holding my hand with false tenderness. But I'm sure she will be happy to participate in the launch ceremony for the scholarship when she feels stronger." The president nodded understandingly. Before leaving, he left an envelope on the table. "These are some texts we found on Liam's computer in the university newspaper's office. We thought you'd like to have them." That envelope changed everything. Arthur, distracted by an important call, didn't notice when I hid it among my clothes. That night, locked in the bathroom, the only place I had a few minutes of privacy, I opened it with trembling hands. They were articles, drafts, notes, mostly about trivial university topics. But there were also fragments of the investigation that had cost Liam his life. Names, dates, dollar amounts, clues as to where he kept the rest of the evidence. It was as if a ray of lucidity pierced the chemical fog I lived in. For the first time since Liam's death, I felt something besides pain and fear. I felt purpose. Those papers were like a message from beyond the grave. "Finish what I started, Mom." I mentally noted the most important information, and with a heavy heart, destroyed the evidence. I tore the papers into tiny pieces and flushed them down the toilet. I couldn't risk Arthur finding them. Even through the chemical fog of grief and medication, that spark of the old Josephine, the investigator, the academic, is still there. Liam has just passed her the torch from beyond the grave. Now, she just has to figure out how to get clean and use it. That night, lying next to my son's killer, a daily torture I endured by pretending to be asleep before he came to the room, I made the decision that would change everything. I would start gradually reducing the medication. I needed a clear mind for what was to come. Instead of swallowing the pills, I started hiding them under my tongue, spitting them out later in the toilet. A trick I learned from the spy novels I loved to read. Who knew I'd ever need that knowledge? Withdrawing from the medication was brutal. Tremors, nausea, insomnia, even worse than before. But I knew I had to get through it. It was like emerging from a dark swamp, reclaiming a little more mental clarity each day. At the same time, I had to maintain the farce. Continue to look like the medicated, submissive widow Arthur expected. It was an exhausting performance, but I had the best incentive possible: justice for Liam. 2 months after his death, I agreed to give an interview. A major paper wanted to do a story on Liam Callahan's legacy and the scholarship created in his memory. Arthur, initially reluctant, finally agreed. "It will be good for our public image," he decided, after weighing the pros and cons. "It will show we are dealing with the loss constructively, as if it were a public relations exercise, not grief for a son." The journalist came to our house. Arthur would never allow me to be interviewed far from his supervision. We sat in the living room. Me, still pale and thin from the pain and medication withdrawal, but with my eyes more alert than they had been in weeks. Arthur sat beside me, his hand on mine in a gesture that, to the journalist, looked like support, but which I knew was control. "Mrs. Callahan, how would you like your son to be remembered?" The question, seemingly simple, was a trap. Arthur squeezed my hand lightly. "A warning. Liam was an idealist," I began, choosing each word carefully. "He believed that the truth should be exposed, no matter who it hit." I felt Arthur stiffen beside me, but I continued. "He died before completing his mission. But I believe his spirit, his commitment to the truth, will live on through the young people who receive this scholarship." The journalist nodded, taking notes. "And you, as a professor and educator, what advice would you give to young journalists who, like your son, investigate difficult, sometimes dangerous topics?" Arthur interjected before I could answer. "I think we would tell them to be careful, to understand the risks. My son didn't comprehend the impact certain revelations could have, not just on the people being investigated, but on himself. He let the psychological pressure phrase hang in the air, perfectly playing the part of the devastated father. I would tell them to never give up," I cut in, ignoring Arthur's furious glare. "To keep their findings in safe places, to share information with trusted people, to understand that sometimes justice is slow, but it arrives. It always arrives." My voice trembled, but not from fear, from contained rage, from determination. Arthur quickly ended the interview, claiming I was becoming emotionally fatigued. That night, we had our first major argument since Liam's death. "What the hell was that?" he hissed as soon as the journalist left. "Keep their findings safe. Justice always arrives. Have you gone completely insane?" I kept my gaze low, submissive, while inside I was seething. "I'm sorry. I think I got carried away. I was trying to sound convincing." He paced back and forth, furious. "You're cutting back on your meds, aren't you?" I denied it vehemently, feigning hurt at the accusation. "How can you think that? I'm following exactly what the doctor prescribed." To prove it, I swallowed the night's pills in front of him. Pills I had replaced with vitamins that looked identical. Years of teaching literature had taught me something about dramatics, about building a convincing character. Arthur seemed to believe me, or at least decided not to press the issue. "Fine. But from now on, I review any public statement you make, word for word." I nodded, feigning resignation. It was a small setback in my plan, but nothing serious. The seed was already planted in that interview, a coded message for anyone who knew how to read between the lines. The following week, I returned to the university for the scholarship launch ceremony. It was my first formal public appearance since the funeral. Arthur, of course, was by my side the entire time. We were the perfect picture of a couple united by tragedy. He, the pillar of strength. I, the fragile but resilient mother. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, dignitaries, even the press showed up. The president gave an emotional speech about Liam, about his interrupted potential, about how the university was proud to have been part of his education. Then he called me to the stage to say a few words and symbolically present the first scholarship to a young journalism student. I went to the podium, trembling. I didn't need to fake that. Seeing all those people, many who truly knew and loved Liam, talking about him based on a lie, was almost unbearable. Arthur watched me from the front row, his gaze a mixture of warning and veiled threat. I took a deep breath and began to speak. "Liam loved the truth above all else," I said, feeling each word as if it were torn from the depths of my soul. "He believed journalism had a sacred mission, to give voice to the silenced, to illuminate what is in the shadows, to hold the powerful accountable." I paused, looking directly at Arthur. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I was taking a risk, getting dangerously close to the line he had drawn, but I calculated that in public, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, I was relatively safe. He couldn't interrupt me without seeming strange, controlling. "This scholarship," I continued, "is not just a tribute to my son's memory. It is a commitment to the values he defended. A reminder that the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how much it threatens, established power structures must always prevail." My voice broke a little on the last sentence, not from acting, but from genuine emotion. I was, in a way, making my own public oath. I handed the certificate to the selected student, a young man from a humble background, whose eyes held the same idealistic fire I used to see in Liam. "Use this opportunity wisely," I told him, off microphone. "There are stories that need to be told, no matter who tries to silence them." The boy nodded, not fully understanding the weight of those words. I returned to my seat amid applause. Arthur grabbed my hand, squeezing it excessively as soon as I sat down. "You are playing with fire," he whispered through clenched teeth, keeping a fixed smile for the cameras. "We will discuss this at home." A chill ran down my spine, but I kept my composure. This is the first test of her new role. She's no longer just a passive victim. She's sending a coded message to the world. Arthur knows she's playing with fire, but he doesn't realize she is the fire. The worst he could do was kill me, and part of me was already dead anyway. The conversation at home was another threatening monologue. Arthur listed all the ways he could destroy me if I continued this inappropriate behavior, from having me committed to a psychiatric hospital to ruining the academic career I had built with such effort. I have friends on the board of trustees. One word from me, and you not only lose your deanship, you'll never get a job at any educational institution in this country again. I listened in silence, head bowed, playing the part of the intimidated wife. Inside, every threat only strengthened my resolve. He could have the power, the money, the connections, but I had something more valuable: time, patience, and above all, the truth on my side. It was that night, after Arthur finally fell asleep, that I began my own investigation, sitting in the walk-in closet, with only the faint light of a flashlight so as not to wake my husband. I began to mentally compile everything I knew. Liam had mentioned documents, evidence. Where would they be? He was too smart to keep everything in one place, especially knowing he was investigating his own father. I remembered something he'd said weeks before he died. "Mom, do you remember that box of keepsakes we stored in the attic of the Poconos house? We haven't been there in a while." At the time, I thought it was just nostalgia. Now, I understood the message between the lines. There was something hidden in that lake house, something Arthur didn't know about. The problem was how to get there. Arthur controlled my movements, my calls, even the money I could access. The nurse, Beatrice, still watched me, though less intensely now that I seemed stabilized. I would have to plan carefully, gradually win back Arthur's trust, make him lower his guard. I started by subtly changing my behavior. I showed signs of improvement. I ate more, slept better, or pretended to. I even smiled occasionally. I talked about returning to work, resuming my life. Arthur observed this transformation with a mixture of relief and suspicion. "I'm glad you're recovering," he commented one night at dinner. "But don't rush. Remember what the doctor said about not making major decisions in the first year after a significant loss." "You're right," I agreed, pouring him more wine, something I had started doing frequently, noticing how his guard dropped after 2 or 3 glasses. In fact, I was thinking, maybe we could spend a weekend at the Poconos. A change of scenery, you know. The house has been closed up for months. He considered the idea, swirling the wine in his glass. "Not a bad idea. The mountain air might do you good." That small victory was just the beginning. In the following weeks, I methodically built my facade as the recovering wife, the widow finding the strength to move on. Simultaneously, I began to discreetly collect information. Every time Arthur left a document out of the safe, I photographed it with my phone. Every suspicious conversation he had on the phone, I noted names and dates in a small notebook hidden inside a thick book on my shelf, a volume of literary criticism I knew he would never open. One night, I found something significant. Arthur had left his laptop open while he showered. Risking more than ever, I quickly accessed his emails. Most were password protected, but there was a recent exchange with someone identified only as MA about a pending payment related to the Coleman case. The tone was coded, but it was clearly about some illicit negotiation. I photographed the screen and returned to my needlepoint before he came out of the bathroom. Small fragments like this, gathered over weeks, began to form a clearer picture of the scheme Arthur was involved in. It was exactly as Liam had discovered. A group of judges selling favorable rulings, laundering the money through shell companies and real estate investments. The Poconos house was just the tip of the iceberg. The isolation Arthur imposed on me ended up becoming my weapon. Since no one visited me besides a few colleagues from the university, always under his supervision, he began to see me as harmless, almost invisible, a piece of furniture, a presence that posed no threat. That was his first strategic mistake. The second mistake was underestimating my intelligence. As a university professor, a researcher, I had spent my life deciphering complex texts, connecting disparate evidence, building coherent narratives from fragments. The same skills that made me a respected academic now served a darker purpose, documenting the crimes of the man I shared a bed with. 3 months after Liam's death, I finally got what I wanted so badly. A weekend at the lake house in the Poconos. Arthur, convinced of my docility, even allowed us to go alone, without the uncomfortable presence of Beatrice. "She has the weekend off anyway," he explained. "And I think we're ready for some time just for us, don't you?" The thought of being alone with him, far from witnesses, in an isolated house, terrified me. But it was my only chance to access what Liam had hidden. During the car ride, I mentally rehearsed every step. I'd have to wait for Arthur to fall asleep or go out to search the attic. I'd have to be quick, careful, leave no trace. And above all, I'd have to keep playing the part of the submissive wife, maybe even feign interest in resuming our intimacy. The thought made me sick, but I was willing to make any sacrifice for justice. The house was exactly as we'd left it, months before Liam's death. Luxurious, impersonal, more a status symbol than a home. While Arthur opened the windows and checked the security system, I discreetly analyzed the access to the attic. The entrance was in the bedroom hallway, a retractable ladder that pulled down from the ceiling. I'd need an excuse to go up there. At dinner, I served Arthur more wine than usual. I spoke of happy memories of how Liam loved this house as a child. For the first time in months, I saw Arthur genuinely relax. Maybe it was the wine, maybe the feeling that he had won, that I had finally accepted the situation. "You know what I'd like to do tomorrow?" I commented as we washed the dishes. "Look for some old photos in the attic. We have those albums from when Liam was little. I think I'm ready to look at them again." Arthur hesitated briefly, then nodded. "If you feel ready, I think that's a good idea. But I don't want you to get upset again." "I won't," I promised, drying a plate. "I think it's part of the healing process, you know? Preserving the good memories." He smiled, apparently satisfied with my progress. Later, when we went to bed, I didn't resist when he approached me. It was the most degrading experience of my life, giving my body to my son's murderer, but it was necessary to complete the illusion of restored normalcy. As he touched me, I imagined I was somewhere else, with someone else. Or rather, I imagined I was someone else, an actress playing a difficult role, nothing more. I know what you're thinking. How could you? I asked myself the same thing. But when you're hunting a monster, sometimes you have to cover yourself in its stench. That is the price of revenge, a price that stains your soul forever. Can we even imagine the strength, or the self-loathing, it took to endure that, to give your body to your child's murderer? This is the true, dark price of her mission. But would the sacrifice be worth it? Keep listening to find out. Arthur slept deeply afterward, thanks to the wine and the false reconciliation. I waited almost an hour, monitoring his breathing, before sliding out of bed. The attic was my destination, but I couldn't risk waking him with the noise of the retractable ladder. I decided to wait until the next morning, when he usually went for a swim in the lake. It would be safer. The next morning arrived with that kind of golden light that only exists by the lakeside. I woke up before Arthur, as planned. I watched him sleep. The lines on his face relaxed, looking almost like the man I fell in love with decades ago. How could someone who seemed so normal, so human, hide so much darkness? That's a question I still ask myself, even after everything that happened. I prepared an elaborate breakfast. Eggs, fresh fruit, bread we bought at the local bakery the day before. When Arthur appeared in the kitchen, smiling and rested, I served him like the perfect wife he believed he had tamed. "I thought I'd look for those photos today after breakfast," I commented casually, passing him the jam. "Need help with that?" he asked, biting into a piece of toast. No, it's something I prefer to do alone. Part of the process, you know, and you deserve to relax a bit. Go for a swim, read that book you brought." He seemed pleased with the suggestion. After breakfast, as was his routine at the lake house, he put on his swimming trunks and went down to the house's private dock. From the porch, I watched until he dove into the water, moving away with strong strokes. Only then did I run to the hallway, pulled down the attic ladder, and climb up quickly. The space was stuffy, full of boxes and trunks accumulated over the years, lots of dust, some cobwebs. I knew exactly what to look for. A blue box labeled Liam, childhood photos. It was where I remembered it, under a pile of unused Christmas decorations. I opened it with trembling hands, hoping to find some clue left by my son. At the bottom of the box, underneath the real photo albums, was a sealed manila envelope. Inside it, a flash drive and a handwritten letter. "Mom, if you're reading this, something went wrong. I only trust you to finish what I started. Everything is on this drive. Documents, recordings, photos. Look for Sarah Mitchell at the U.S. Attorney's Office. She'll know what to do. Don't trust anyone else. I love you." Tears streamed down my face as I read and reread those words. Liam had foreseen the danger. He had created a safety net, and now he was passing the baton to me. I tucked the flash drive and the letter into my bra, the only place I was sure Arthur wouldn't check, and put the box back exactly as I found it. I climbed down from the attic, closed the ladder, and went to the bathroom to wash my face, removing any trace of tears. When Arthur returned from his swim, he found me on the porch, flipping through an old photo album with a melancholy but serene expression. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked, drying himself with a towel. "Yes," I replied, showing him a photo of Liam as a child. "So many good memories." He seemed relieved, perhaps even touched. He sat beside me, put his arm around my shoulders. This is how we should remember him, in the happy moments. That weekend in the Poconos was the beginning of a journey that would last 3 long years. 3 years of meticulous planning, constant acting, and almost superhuman patience. 3 years pretending I had accepted my son's death, that I believed the official story, that I was rebuilding my life alongside the man who destroyed everything I loved. I couldn't access the flash drive immediately. It would be too risky in our apartment, where Arthur could appear at any moment. I waited until I returned to the university, now on a part-time basis, recovering gradually, as I explained to people. In my office with the door locked, I finally saw what Liam had gathered. It was much worse than I imagined. Not just Arthur, but 4 other federal judges were involved in a sophisticated pay-to-play scheme. There were recordings of conversations, bank statements, documents from offshore companies, even photos of meetings with lawyers and businessmen. The scheme moved millions. Our Poconos house was just the visible tip of the iceberg. Liam had also identified the aforementioned Sarah Mitchell, a young federal prosecutor investigating corruption in the judiciary. He had tried to contact her the week before his death. I knew I had to act with extreme caution. A single mistake, and I could end up like my son. But unlike him, I had advantages. I knew the enemy intimately. I slept next to him every night, and he no longer saw me as a threat. Plus, I had the perfect cover, the university dean, slowly recovering from a tragedy, returning to her academic and social life. My first action was to create security systems for the information. I made multiple copies of the flash drive, hiding them in different locations. One in a false bottom of a drawer at the university, another inside a book in the private library of a trusted friend who believed she was just holding notes for a surprise book, and one in a safe deposit box rented under a false name with documents Liam had arranged for his investigation. Next, I needed to better understand the legal world to navigate this labyrinth of crime. I started to take an interest in Arthur's work as part of my recovery. I'd ask him to explain cases, legal terms, judicial procedures. "I want to understand this world that was always so important to you and to Liam," I'd say with innocent eyes. Arthur, flattered and increasingly confident in my support, became almost didactic, explaining legal concepts over dinner. Simultaneously, I created a study group at the university on ethics and law in American literature. Seemingly innocuous, the group allowed me to invite jurists, prosecutors, and lawyers for lectures and discussions. Among them, discreetly, were people who might be useful later, including a retired DA who became my informal mentor, believing he was helping an academic interested in changing fields after a trauma. The second year was dedicated to building a network. Arthur, now completely confident in my role as a dedicated and recovered wife, began including me in important social events, dinners with other judges, parties at the homes of powerful lawyers, charity galas attended by Philadelphia's legal elite. At these events, I was the perfect hostess, the proud wife, the interesting academic who attracted conversation, and most importantly, the harmless woman no one minded having around when sensitive subjects came up. I started using a small recorder hidden in specially modified jewelry, a brooch that looked merely decorative, a locket that had belonged to my mother, now with a tiny microphone embedded inside. Technology wasn't my strong suit, but Liam had contacts in that area people mentioned in his notes who, when approached cautiously, were willing to help the mother of that promising young journalist who died so young. The recordings began to pile up, seemingly innocent conversations that, in the right context, became devastating evidence. Company names, dollar amounts, trial dates. A drunk judge laughing about how he'd solved that little problem for the contractor, Mr. Coleman. A lawyer thanking Arthur for the special treatment in the mining company case. Small pieces of a monstrous puzzle. At the end of the second year, I felt I was ready for the riskiest step, contacting Sarah Mitchell, the prosecutor Liam had mentioned. I found out she was giving a lecture on systemic corruption at the law school. I convinced Arthur it would be good for my professional image to attend, to show support for the legal institutions, even after our personal tragedy. He agreed, vain about the idea of his wife representing the family at an important event. What he didn't know was that I had another plan. I arrived early, sought out Sarah before the lecture. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Josephine Callahan. My son, Liam, tried to contact you before." I didn't need to finish the sentence. The immediate recognition in her eyes told me everything. "Mrs. Callahan," she replied formally, "it would be a pleasure to speak with you after the lecture. I have great admiration for your academic work. A calculated, professional response that wouldn't raise suspicion if someone was watching or listening." After the presentation, we exchanged business cards. On the back of hers, she had discreetly written, "La Colombe, Thursday, 3 p.m., a public but quiet place, far from the legal or academic circles we frequented. On the scheduled day, I told Arthur I had a department meeting something tedious about the annual budget. He rarely questioned my professional activities anymore. Another strategic mistake on his part. At the coffee shop, Sarah was accompanied by a man who didn't introduce himself, but who was clearly some kind of security or assistant. We sat at a remote table. "Your son contacted me 3 days before he died," she said without preamble, after the assistant checked that there were no bugs or cameras nearby. "He said he had bombshell evidence of corruption at the federal courthouse. We scheduled a meeting, but he never showed up." Her eyes fixed on mine. "When I heard about his death, I immediately suspected it wasn't suicide." "It wasn't," I confirmed, a lump forming in my throat. It was the first time I had said it aloud to anyone. "My husband murdered him. He poisoned him during dinner at our home." Sarah showed no surprise, just controlled anger. "Do you have proof of that?" I nodded. "I have proof of everything. The murder, the pay-to-play scheme, the offshore companies, the money. Everything Liam discovered, plus what I've collected myself over the last 2 years." She kept her face impassive, professional, but her eyes shone with something I recognized immediately. The same thirst for justice my son had. "Why did you wait so long to contact me?" I explained my situation. The threats, the constant surveillance, the need to gain Arthur's trust, to build a solid case. "I understand your caution. But I need to warn you. This is going to be brutal for you, too. You will be investigated, questioned about your own participation or knowledge of the schemes. The public doesn't look kindly on wives who knew nothing." Her tone wasn't accusatory, just realistic. "I'm prepared," I replied. "I don't care what they think of me. I just want justice for my son, and I want those men to pay for turning the judicial system into a commodity. This is the moment the investigation goes pro. Josephine isn't just a grieving mother anymore. She's a key informant in a massive federal case. The alliance is forged, and the clock starts ticking toward the takedown. We established a secure communication protocol. Document deliveries made through trusted third parties, rare meetings, always in unpredictable locations. I used my academic position as cover. Seminars, lectures, and conferences became opportunities for discreet information exchanges. The 3rd year was the hardest. While I was helping Sarah build the case, I had to maintain the farce at home. Arthur, now completely confident in his control over me, shared more and more details about his business. He even reached the point of asking my opinions on where to invest certain sums. Dirty money, which needed to be laundered through real estate, art, shell companies. "What do you think about buying a vineyard in Napa Valley?" he asked one night, as if we were deciding on a new sofa. "Seems like a good investment, and you've always liked wines." I smiled, suggesting instead an art gallery, something that would be easier to monitor and document for the authorities. He loved the idea, impressed with my business sense. Little did he know that every suggestion I made was carefully planned to create more evidence against him. At home, I kept a coded diary. Ostensibly, it was notes for an academic book on literature and grief. In reality, it was a detailed log of conversations, meetings, and dollar amounts mentioned. I used a code system inspired by literary analysis that only I could understand, referring to people and companies as characters from the American novels I studied. It was risky, but necessary to keep track of so much information without relying on memory alone. Arthur started taking me to dinners with the other judges in the scheme. Occasionally, their wives were also present. Women who, like me, lived in mansions built with dirty money, wore jewelry bought with bribes, took luxury vacations financed by sold rulings. I watched them with a mixture of pity and revulsion. How many knew? How many preferred not to know? One of these women, Clara, the wife of Judge Barry, the oldest in the scheme, once pulled me aside during one of these dinners. "You're different, Josephine. More. Present." Her gaze was penetrating, as if trying to see beyond my carefully constructed mask. "Tragedy changes you, doesn't it?" I replied vaguely. She nodded, looking around at their husbands, who were chatting animatedly. "Some things are better left unknown," she murmured, before returning to the group with an artificial smile. I never knew if she suspected me, or if she was, in her own way, trying to warn me. Meanwhile, Sarah worked tirelessly. The operation was taking shape behind the scenes, carefully planned to avoid leaks. "We're dealing with people who have informants at every level of the system," she explained during one of our rare meetings. "Judges, police captains, even prosecutors. We need a small, ironclad core." The date was finally set. March 14th. Exactly 3 years and 2 months after Liam's death. The eve of the operation was the longest night of my life. I had dinner with Arthur as if it were any other night. He talked about an important case he'd be ruling on the following week. A corruption case, ironically. "This one's going to be work. But the defense attorney is Mr. Wallace. You met him at that dinner at Vetri Cucina, remember? He always knows how to make things more interesting for everyone involved." I nodded, pouring him more wine. "I'm sure you'll find the most appropriate solution, dear. You always do." He smiled, satisfied with my understanding. I looked at that smile, knowing it would be the last night we spent together as husband and wife. I felt many things: fear, anticipation, even a strange nostalgia for the marriage I once believed I had. But I felt no remorse. The operation began at 5 a.m. The phone rang, waking us. Arthur answered, sleepy. His expression changed in seconds from confusion to disbelief, then to panic. "There must be some mistake," he was saying. "This is absurd. I'm a federal judge, for God's sake." When he hung up, he was pale. "The FBI is on their way. Something about an anti-corruption operation. It's complete madness." I played my final role, the shocked, confused wife. "What? What are you talking about?" He started getting dressed hastily. "Nothing. Some misunderstanding. Call Mr. Wallace immediately. And Mr. Hayes, too. Names of powerful lawyers, part of the same scheme. Tell them it's urgent." I picked up the phone, pretending to make the calls while he ran to his study. I heard the sound of the paper shredder, of drawers being opened and closed. It wouldn't do him much good. The real evidence, the evidence that mattered, hadn't been under his control for a long time. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. FBI agents with search and arrest warrants. Arthur tried to block their entry, invoking prerogatives, immunities, all sorts of legal arguments. It was useless. The operation had been authorized by the U.S. Court of Appeals based on irrefutable evidence. I watched my living room being searched, documents being seized, computers confiscated. An officer approached me. "Mrs. Callahan, I need you to come with us as well." Arthur, already in handcuffs, looked at me in confusion. "Josephine has nothing to do with this. She's just my wife, for God's sake." The officer was impassive. "We have questions for you too, ma'am." It was only then, seeing my calmness in the face of the situation, that something seemed to click in Arthur's head. "You," he whispered, incredulous. "It was you?" At one look, that moment of devastating recognition. For 3 years, Arthur saw her as a broken, grieving widow. In this instant, he finally sees the master manipulator who beat him at his own game. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. My eyes said everything necessary as I was led out to a different car from his. Yes, it was me. For 3 years, I was his obedient doll. For 3 years, I was the pitiful, broken wife. In that one last second, I wanted him to know who was really pulling the strings. That was my justice. For Liam. I was taken not to a police station, but to a discreet federal building. Sarah was waiting for me in a conference room with 2 senior investigators. "It's done," she said, without smiling. It wasn't a moment for celebration. We arrested all 5 judges simultaneously, along with 11 lawyers and 7 businessmen involved in the scheme. Now comes the hardest part for you. The following days were a torrent of depositions, sworn statements, evidence review. I had to relive every moment of those 3 years of personal investigation, every dinner where information was collected, every recorded conversation. The worst part, I had to detail Liam's death, the poisoning, the suicide farce, my forced role in the cover-up. "Why didn't you report it immediately?" the investigators asked repeatedly, in different ways. I explained about the threats, about Arthur's network of influence, about my plan to gather enough evidence not only to convict him of the murder, but to dismantle the entire scheme my son had discovered. He would have walked if I had reported it that night. It would have been my word against his, and he was a respected federal judge. I was just the wife, unbalanced by the death of her son. The press had a field day with the case. The avenging widow screamed one tabloid, with my photo leaving the prosecutor's office. "Professor brings down corrupt judicial ring," announced another, more soberly. The reports oscillated between portraying me as a courageous hero who sacrificed everything for justice, or as a cold manipulator who deceived everyone for years. The truth, as always, was more complex than any headline. The university granted me paid leave, a gesture of support disguised as institutional concern. Some colleagues pulled away, fearing association with the scandal. Others showed silent solidarity. Small gestures, a flower left at my door, an encouraging note. The students organized a vigil in support, with signs quoting phrases from my classes on ethics and truth. That moved me more than any positive headline. The trial began 6 months after the arrests. Arthur and the other defendants, once imposing figures in robes and power, now appeared diminished in their suits, ties confiscated to prevent suicides, sitting in the dock. In contrast to the secret investigation, the trial was public, televised, dissected by legal experts on TV shows. My testimony lasted 3 whole days. On the stand, under oath, I told the whole story. From the moment Liam discovered his father's criminal activities, to the fatal dinner, the suicide farce, and my 3 years of parallel investigation. The toughest questions came from Arthur's defense, led by the only renowned lawyer who took the case more out of professional vanity than belief in his client's innocence. "Mrs. Callahan, you waited 3 years to report the alleged murder of your son. 3 years living normally with the man you claim committed this heinous crime. 3 years sharing a bed, a table, a social life with him. How do you expect this court to believe your version?" I looked directly at the lawyer, then at Arthur, who was staring at me with pure hatred. I did not live normally, counselor. I lived every minute of those 3 years with the sole purpose of ensuring justice was done, not just for my son, but for every person harmed by the corruption schemes he uncovered. If I had reported it immediately, without concrete proof beyond my testimony, would we be here today? Or would the case have been dismissed for lack of evidence, while Arthur continued to sell rulings and destroy lives? The lawyer pressed on, trying to destabilize me. "And you don't fear being indicted as an accomplice? After all, by your own admission, you helped conceal a homicide, actively participated in building the suicide farce, and lived with criminal activity for years without reporting it. I fear many things, counselor. I fear that people like your client will continue to rot our institutions from the inside. I fear that other mothers will lose their sons to the impunity of the powerful. If the price for bringing down this scheme is my own conviction, I am prepared to pay it. Some truths require sacrifice. This is her ultimate transformation, no longer the frightened wife, but a public figure defining her own narrative. She's not just seeking justice for Liam, she's challenging the entire corrupt system, and she's willing to pay the price." My answer caused a stir in the courtroom. The judge called for order, but the murmuring continued for a B-flat. I saw Sarah in the audience, discreetly nodding in approval. The trial dragged on for weeks. Dozens of witnesses, mountains of documents, recordings, bank statements. The defense tried to invalidate evidence, claim illegalities in the investigation, disqualify witnesses, but the case was too solid. Finally, the sentences. Arthur was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years, plus 17 for passive bribery, money laundering, and racketeering. The other judges received similar sentences. Lawyers and businessmen got shorter, but still significant, prison terms. As for me, the DA's office decided not to press charges, recognizing the irresistible coercion I had acted under initially and my fundamental role in dismantling the scheme subsequently. A controversial decision that sparked heated legal debates, but one that was upheld at all levels. Leaving the courthouse after the sentencing, a reporter shoved a microphone in my face. "Mrs. Callahan, do you regret anything?" I stopped, reflected for a moment. I regret not realizing sooner who the man I married really was. I regret every sign I ignored, every excuse I accepted. Maybe, if I had been more attentive, my son would still be alive. Justice was done, everyone says. The scheme was dismantled, the guilty are in prison. My son was avenged. But justice doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't fill the void left by a life cut short at 22. It doesn't erase the memories of the years spent living next to a monster, pretending not to be one myself. After the trial, I couldn't go back to our house, that mansion built with dirty money, where my son was murdered. I sold it, donating half the value to a foundation, supporting investigative journalists, and the other half to a non-profit that helps families of violent crime victims. I bought a small, anonymous apartment in a quiet Philadelphia neighborhood. I tried to rebuild a life. Teach again, write articles, keep my mind busy. But some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, reliving the moment Liam fell from his chair, convulsing, while Arthur watched with clinical coldness. Or worse, reliving the moments I smiled at my son's killer, served him wine, allowed his touch, all in the name of the greater plan. In those moments, the line between justice and revenge, between necessity and choice, becomes so blurred I can barely breathe. Sarah visits me sometimes. She's become a friend, as much as possible. She was the one who convinced me to accept a small witness protection program. Not a full new identity, but some security measures. "The tentacles of this scheme are long," she explained, "and there are powerful people we still haven't caught, who might want revenge." The last time we met, she brought surprising news. We found something interesting in the operations archives, a record of Liam's access to a specific document, days before he died. She showed me a printed sheet. It was a birth certificate. Mine. With a note in the margin I had never seen before. "Liam found this while investigating Arthur," Sarah continued. "Apparently, your husband also had this information for years. He used it against you when he needed to, didn't he?" I nodded, a lump in my throat. It revealed the man who raised me, Walter Rossi, was not my biological father. Arthur had mentioned family secrets. This is what he knew. "You never mentioned this in your testimony," Sarah observed, no accusation in her voice. "It wasn't relevant to the case," I replied simply. She nodded, understanding. "Well, I thought you should have it. It's your history, after all." I folded the paper carefully, tucked it in my purse. A family secret Arthur had used as a weapon, but which was now just another fragment of the past to be processed, integrated into my story. One more reminder that we all wear masks, we all carry secrets. The difference is what we choose to do with them. Leaving the coffee shop where we met, I looked up at the Philadelphia sky, gray, overcast, but still vast with possibilities. 3 years acting as the devoted wife of the man who killed my son. Another year of investigations and trials. And now, the rest of my life trying to find meaning in it all. Is there true justice in this world? Or only imperfect approximations, achieved at too high a cost? That's a question that may never have an answer. But I keep searching. Life after the storm is strange. You survive the worst you could imagine. Watching your son die, living with his murderer, exposing a criminal network embedded in the judicial system. And then you ask yourself, and now what? What comes after the revenge, after the justice? How do you rebuild a life from the rubble? The silence was the first thing I noticed after the trial. Not a literal silence, the press continued to talk, analyze, and dissect every detail of the case for months. But a social silence grew around me like an invisible wall. Old friends stopped calling. Colleagues averted their gaze in the university hallways. Invitations to academic events dwindled, then stopped completely. No one wanted to be associated with the widow of the corrupt judge, the woman who lived a lie for 3 years. I returned to the university 2 months after the sentencing. The president, the same one who had created the memorial scholarship for Liam, received me with excessive formality in his office. "Josephine, we are glad you've decided to return. We obviously understand how difficult this entire process was for you." His words sounded rehearsed. His eyes avoided mine. "However, we feel it might be best to reduce your administrative load at this time. For your own well-being." I understood the message between the lines. I was being politely demoted. No longer dean, just a professor. You see, I had taken the trash out of the system, a festering rot. But institutions? Oh, they don't like the person who cleans house, not when the filth sticks to powerful people. They couldn't fire me, but they could bury me. That is the price you pay for daring to break their pact of silence. On my way out, his secretary, a woman who had known me for over 15 years, whispered, "A lot of pressure from the trustees, Dr. Callahan. Some of them have connections to people affected by the operation." I nodded, unsurprised. The roots of corruption ran deep, intertwined in institutions that presented themselves as bastions of ethics and knowledge. My first class after returning was a surreal experience. The room was packed, not with my usual students, but with curious onlookers from other departments, even some journalists who had managed to sneak in. Everyone wanted to see the woman from the scandal in action. I felt the stares, heard the whispers. For 50 minutes, I lectured on Melville and his critique of American institutions in the 19th century. The irony did not escape me. "Professor," a student asked at the end, "do you think there's any parallel between the hypocritical society Melville criticized and the institutions your husband and his colleagues corrupted?" The entire room held its breath. It was the question everyone wanted to ask, but only one had the courage. I looked at that young woman, perhaps the age Liam would have been if he were alive, and I saw in her the same spark of nonconformity. I think Melville would be saddened, but not surprised, to see that 150 years later, we still have one justice system for the rich and another for the poor, with institutions that serve those who occupy them more than the society they are meant to protect. I paused. And I think he would approve of anyone who, even alone, decided not to accept that as normal or inevitable. That answer, transcribed and published in a university paper, caused more problems with the administration. I was called back to the president's office. "Josephine, I understand your situation, but we must maintain a professional distance between recent events and the academic content." I smiled, with a calm I didn't feel. "Mr. President, I spent 3 years faking a separation that doesn't exist between personal and professional ethics. I don't intend to continue that farce. I left there knowing my days at the university were numbered. They wouldn't fire me, the scandal would be too big, but they would find ways to suffocate me until I quit. Reduced classes, impossible time slots, exclusion from important committees. The tactics were subtle but effective. It was during this period of institutional isolation that I had the idea. If the university didn't want to deal with the ethical implications of the case, I would create a space where those discussions were not only allowed, but encouraged. Using my own money, what was left from the sale of the house, plus compensation I received as a victim in the lawsuit, I rented a small space near the campus. I called it the Liam Callahan Center for Ethics and Transparency. At first, it was just one room with a few tables, computers, and a small specialized library. I invited students interested in investigative journalism and judicial ethics for unofficial workshops. Participation was small at first. Only the bravest dared to associate their names with mine. But gradually, interest grew. I taught what I had learned in the most painful way possible: how to document evidence safely, how to build protection networks for sensitive information, how to recognize the signs of institutional corruption. What you learn in your methodology classes are the rules of a clean game, I explained to the students. What I teach here are the rules of survival when the game is rigged. Sarah, the prosecutor who had become an ally, occasionally came to give lectures. She brought real cases, properly anonymized, showing how corruption schemes worked and how they were dismantled. The students absorbed every word, fascinated by this practical knowledge that no formal discipline offered. Within 6 months, the center had become a reference point for journalism, law, and social science students interested in ethical investigation. Paradoxically, the more the university tried to marginalize me officially, the more relevant I became in the parallel circuit I had created. It was around this time that I received the first contact from other families. It started with a timid email from a woman named Erin. "Professor Callahan, my husband was unjustly convicted for refusing to participate in a scheme similar to the one you exposed. No one believes our story. What can we do?" I scheduled a coffee with Erin. Her story was devastating. A lower court judge who reported colleagues for selling rulings and ended up being accused of corruption himself, with planted evidence. By the time I met her, her husband had already been in prison for 2 years. She had lost their house. Her children were being bullied at school. The system had closed ranks against them with the same efficiency it had almost crushed me. "Do you have copies of the original report your husband filed? Names, dates, any evidence he might have kept?" I asked, feeling that same investigative energy that had sustained me for 3 years coming back to life. She shook her head, disheartened. He tried to do everything through official channels, believing in the system. He didn't keep anything. I called Sarah that same week. I presented Erin's case, asked if there was anything we could do. "Officially, my hands are tied, Josephine. I can't reopen a case without substantial new evidence." She paused significantly. "But I can point you to some trusted colleagues who might be interested in investigating certain patterns of behavior in that judicial district." This was the beginning of what would later become the support group for families of white-collar crime victims, a technical name for something deeply personal. We started with monthly meetings at the center. Me, Erin, and gradually other people who heard about us through lawyers, journalists, or simple word of mouth, wives of persecuted whistleblowers, children of honest businessmen ruined for refusing to pay bribes, relatives of journalists who died in suspiciously convenient accidents after sensitive investigations. Our meetings weren't just therapeutic, although mutual support was essential. We were also an action group. We shared information, connected people to ethical lawyers and trustworthy prosecutors, helped organize documentation for cases that could be reopened. Sarah and other professionals in the legal system who sympathized with our cause guided us discreetly. In one of these meetings, Rachel, the wife of an accountant who was imprisoned after reporting fraud at a large construction company, asked something that caught me off guard. "Josephine, how do you manage to visit your son's grave, knowing that for so long he was buried under a lie?" The question hit me like a punch. I realized I had avoided the cemetery since the trial ended. Liam's grave still bore the original headstone, with the lie of his suicide literally engraved in stone. "I can't," I admitted, feeling tears I thought had dried up return with full force. "I still haven't been able to." The next day, I received messages from everyone in the group. They had organized in my support. On Sunday, 6 of them were waiting for me at the cemetery gates. "We're here for you, just as you've been for us," Erin said, holding my hand. Together, we walked to Liam's grave. Someone had brought flowers. Another, a small, temporary plaque to cover the original inscription. It was the first time I was able to truly mourn my son's death. Not just the pain of the loss, but the injustice of it all. The interrupted life, the suffocated truth, the years of pretense. I cried for what he could have been, for the stories he never wrote, for the grandchildren I would never know. But I also cried with gratitude for his unexpected legacy. This community of people united by the search for justice, this purpose that now guided my life. In the following weeks, I arranged for a new headstone. No euphemisms, no lies. Liam Callahan, 1995 to 2017. Journalist. He sought the truth until the end. The truth set him free. It was my final declaration, my definitive refusal to perpetuate the silence that had imprisoned us for so long. I began to visit the cemetery regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with members of the support group. I'd bring flowers, Tell Liam about the center that bore his name, about the students he was inspiring, about the cases we were helping to reopen. On one of those days, I found a young woman I didn't know, leaving a small arrangement on the grave. "I'm sorry," she said, embarrassed when she saw me. "I didn't know you'd be here today." She introduced herself as Chloe, a former classmate of Liam's in the journalism program. "He helped me a lot in my freshman year when I almost dropped out. I come here every now and then, ever since. Well, ever since we learned the truth about what happened." We talked for hours that day. Chloe had graduated, was working for an independent news portal. Liam's story, his courage, and yours, too, it changed the way I see our profession. It's not just about writing well or getting a scoop. It's about persisting when everything and everyone tells you to stop. Chloe wasn't the only former colleague or friend of Liam's who reappeared after the truth was revealed. Gradually, people who had pulled away, believing the suicide story, came back. Some, ashamed for having doubted. Others, simply wanting to reconnect with his memory in a more honest way. One of these reunions caught me completely off guard. One afternoon, while organizing books at the center, I heard the door open. I looked up and saw an elderly woman leaning on a cane. I recognized her immediately, although we had only seen each other a few times over the years. Clara, the wife of Judge Barry, the oldest member of the scheme Arthur was part of. "Josephine," she said, her voice trembling. "May I come in?" I pointed to a chair, observing how the years and events seemed to have weighed on her. Her husband had been sentenced to 32 years, longer than Arthur, due to his central role in the scheme. "I came to tell you," she hesitated, searching for the right words, "that I knew. Not everything. Not about your son. I would never imagine they were capable of that. But about the rest, the money, the sold rulings." Her wrinkled hands trembled on her purse. "And I never said anything. I never did anything." I didn't feel anger toward her, surprisingly, just a deep sadness, for another life wasted on the altar of convenience and silence. "Why are you telling me this now, Clara?" "Because I want someone to know I wasn't stupid. That I wasn't just the foolish, blind wife everyone thinks I am. I made a choice. A terrible choice. And I will die with that weight." Tears streamed down her powdered face. "And because I wanted to say, you did what I never had the courage to do. You broke the pact of silence." Two women who lived the same lie but made tragically different choices. Clara chose the comfort of silence and lost herself. Josephine weaponized her silence and found justice. It just shows you, the pact of silence is only as strong as the people who agree to keep it. I looked at that poor woman, and I wondered, how many Claras are out there? How many choose silence? For comfort, for security. I could have been her, you know. But no, my silence was a weapon. Hers was a prison. After she left, I thought about how many Claras there are out there. People who know, who see, but who choose the comfort of silence. In academic institutions, legal, political, corporate, silence is never neutral. It is always an active choice, a complicity disguised as discretion. I started talking about this in lectures I began giving at universities around the country, not my own, which continued to keep me at a distance, but at other institutions less afraid of associating with my name. Academic silence in the face of abuses of power is not scientific neutrality, I argued. It is cowardice disguised as objectivity. The lectures usually filled auditoriums. There was a hunger for this kind of frank discussion about the institutions that supposedly protect us but frequently fail us. Students, especially, seem to resonate with the message that knowledge without action is just a sophisticated form of complicity. In one of these lectures, in Pittsburgh, an elderly professor raised his hand during the Q&A. "Dr. Callahan, you talk a lot about breaking the silence, but don't you fear that by exposing so many institutional flaws, you are undermining public trust in the legal and academic systems as a whole? Wouldn't it be more constructive to work discreetly for internal reforms?" It was an objection I had heard many times, usually from people well established within the systems I criticized. "Professor, silence already undermined that trust a long time ago. Ordinary people already know the system is flawed. The difference is that Now we are naming those flaws, identifying those responsible, and showing that there are consequences. That doesn't destroy trust. It's the only way to restore it. The journey of reconstruction wasn't just public and professional. There was also the internal work, harder to deal with, my own guilt. For 3 years, I played the part of the devoted wife to my son's killer. I slept beside him, smiled in photos, attended social events. Even knowing it was necessary to get justice, those actions left scars on my soul. I started therapy, something I had avoided for fear of exposing vulnerabilities during the years of secret investigation. My therapist, a sharp woman specializing in trauma, helped me understand that my guilt was part of Arthur's toxic legacy, a final form of control he exerted over me. Even from prison, you did what you had to do to survive and get justice, she would remind me when I tormented myself for not reporting it immediately. In extreme situations, the normal rules of ethics don't apply in the same way. You were at war. Gradually, I learned to transform that guilt into constructive action. Every time the center helped a student publish an important investigation, every time our support group managed to reopen an unjust case, I felt I was honoring Liam's memory in a way he would approve of. 5 years after the trial, I received an unexpected email. It was from the journalism department chair at my university. Not a particular ally, but someone who had always maintained a cordial neutrality. Dear Professor Callahan, we would like to invite you to teach a new elective course next semester. Ethics and Risks in Investigative Journalism. We feel your unique experience would be valuable to our students. The offer caught me by surprise. After years of being sidelined, relegated to basic courses and inconvenient time slots, they suddenly wanted to leverage my unique experience. My first impulse was to refuse, to interpret the invitation as institutional opportunism. But then I thought, wasn't this exactly the kind of space within the system I had been seeking? I accepted, with conditions. The course would be open not just to journalism students, but also to law, social sciences, and other interested programs. I would have total autonomy over the content and methods. And, most importantly, I could bring in outside guests, including members of our support group, who would share first-hand experiences about the personal cost of confronting corrupt systems. To my surprise, all conditions were accepted. The class filled up on the first day of registration, with a long waiting list. In the inaugural class, I looked at those young, eager, idealistic faces, and I saw Liam's face reflected in each of them. I felt a mixture of hope and fear. Hope for their enthusiasm. Fear for what the world might do to that idealism. You probably signed up for this course expecting a sensational story, I began, watching a few faces flush with embarrassment. And yes, I will share details of my personal experience when it's relevant. But this is not a course about me, or about my son. It's about you, and the kind of professionals and citizens you will choose to be when confronted with inconvenient truths. Over the semester, I watched something extraordinary happen. Those students didn't just absorb knowledge, they transformed. They began to question structures they had previously accepted as given. They developed a critical eye, not just for external institutions, but for their own daily ethical choices. They argued, they disagreed, they reached different conclusions, but always with a deeper awareness of the implications of their positions. On the last day of class, a law student raised her hand. Professor, after everything you've been through, do you still believe institutions can change? That it's worth fighting for them? It was the fundamental question, the one I asked myself in moments of doubt. I believe institutions are like houses, I answered after a moment of reflection. They can be built on solid or rotten foundations. They can shelter both criminals and defenders of justice. The structure itself isn't good or bad. It depends on who inhabits it and how they choose to use it. I paused, thinking how to frame the rest of the thought. If we abandon our institutions entirely, we leave the field open for those who want to use them only for their own benefit. Real change comes from within. But sometimes, you have to be willing to break down a few walls to let the light and fresh air in. That class became special. Many of those students continued to frequent the center even after the course ended. Some became regular volunteers at the support group. Others started research projects and reports on topics no one else wanted to touch. I saw in them a continuation of the work Liam started. Not in the exact same way, but with the same nonconformist spirit. One of those students, Noah, came to me at the end of the year with an unexpected proposal. He worked part-time at a documentary production company and wanted to make a film about Liam's case and its repercussions. Not to exploit the tragedy, Professor, but to show how a single act of courage can trigger systemic change. My first instinct was to refuse. I had already seen sensationalist versions of our story on TV shows and in superficial reports, but Noah was different. He had spent months at the center. He knew the work we did. He understood the ethical nuances involved. Most importantly, he deeply respected Liam's memory. "If we're going to do this, I want it to be honest," I finally replied. "No simple good versus evil narrative. No turning Liam into a perfect martyr or Arthur into a one-dimensional villain. The story is about human choices and their consequences, both the obvious ones and the ones we only realize years later." The documentary Broken Silences was released 2 years later. Modest in budget, but powerful in content. Noah managed to get interviews not just with me, but with Sarah, with members of the support group, with Liam's former colleagues, and even with one of the lawyers involved in the scheme who had served his time and decided to talk. Most surprising, he got a brief interview with Arthur, filmed at the federal penitentiary where he was serving his sentence. Seeing my ex-husband on the screen older, but still with that same calculating look, was disturbing. He said little, denied everything, portrayed me as a manipulative and vengeful wife. But his eyes, those eyes I knew so well, they told another story. There was something broken in him, not from remorse, but from being caught, exposed, defeated. The documentary had an impact none of us expected. Independent film festivals, university screenings, even an edited version aired on television. Most importantly, it generated a wave of similar reports. Other Josephines, other Liams, who had faced corrupt systems and been silenced, found the courage to speak. Sarah called me a few months after the launch. "Your film caused quite a stir at the U.S. Attorney's Office, you know. We're receiving tips about similar schemes in other states. Some with concrete evidence." There was a tone of admiration in her voice. "You transformed your pain into something much bigger than personal revenge, Josephine. You've created a movement. I hadn't thought of it in those terms." For me, it was just the fulfillment of a silent promise I made to my son that terrible night when I watched him die in my arms. A promise that his death would not be in vain, that the truth he sought would come to light, no matter how long it took. Today, almost 10 years after losing Liam, I still wonder if I could have done it differently. If there was any path that could have saved my son and still exposed the truth, that doubt will probably follow me for the rest of my life. But I also know that the work we do at the center, in the support group, in the classroom, in the documentary, it's a legacy he would approve of. Recently, I got a call from Aaron, the first person who came to us for help years ago. "Josephine, I don't know if you heard the news. Paul's case was reopened. All that evidence we collected, the patterns we identified in other cases, the witnesses we found. The DA's office is taking it seriously this time." Her choked voice conveyed an emotion I knew well, the bittersweet mix of joy at the possibility of justice and sadness for the lost years. "He might be released before Christmas, if all goes well," she continued. "And you know what he said when I told him? That the first thing he wants to do is go to the center to thank you and the team personally. He said you believed in him when no one else did." After hanging up, I stood for a long time looking out the window of my small apartment. Outside, Philadelphia continued its frenetic routine. Cars, people, life moving on its relentless course. I thought of all the stories similar to mine and Aaron's happening at this very moment. People facing impossible choices, corrupted systems, the crushing weight of imposed silence. I also thought of the small victories we have been winning, the reopened cases, the validated reports, the students who leave our classes with a deeper understanding of their ethical responsibilities, the slow, painful, but real transformation that occurs when enough people decide that silence is no longer an option. Tomorrow will be 10 years since Liam left us. I will go to the cemetery, as I always do on this date. But this time, I won't go alone. Former students, members of the support group, journalists inspired by his story, they've all asked to accompany me. We'll bring flowers, yes, but also something more valuable. The testimony that his search for the truth lives on, multiplied in dozens of other people he never met, but who carry his spirit in some way. Last week, a young journalist asked me what advice I would give to someone who found themselves in a situation similar to the one I faced, torn between loyalties, pressured into silence, afraid of the consequences of speaking out. I thought for a long time before answering. There's no magic formula, I said finally. Every situation is unique. Every person has their limits, their fears, their responsibilities. What I can say is this: seek allies, even if they seem unlikely. Document everything, even if it seems insignificant at the time. And remember that silence, while sometimes necessary for survival, should never be a final destination. It is only a pause. To breathe, to plan, to gather strength. The journalist nodded, taking notes. Then she looked up with one last question. Do you regret anything? I regret not knowing my son better while he was alive, I answered honestly, not realizing the depth of his integrity, his courage. I regret every family dinner where we talked about trivial things while the important issues stayed submerged. Silence inside the home can be just as destructive as institutional silence. This is my story. A story about how silence can be both a prison and a weapon. About how institutions can be complicit in injustice or instruments of transformation, depending on who occupies them and for what purpose. About how the truth, no matter how painful, is the only path to true healing, personal or social. I lost everything. My son, my career, and 25 years of my life believing a lie. But in the end, I got the one thing Liam died to protect: the truth. My story is proof that justice can be delayed, but it cannot be denied. Our channel is dedicated to these kinds of journeys to find hidden truths. If you believe in the power of exposing what's wrong, please hit subscribe and click on the video now showing on your screen to hear another incredible story about a woman who brought down an entire corporation with nothing but persistence.